Hello and welcome to Nothing Worth Saying, our podcast on current affairs, history and politics. Today we're going to be discussing Boris Johnson, who recently got chosen to be the Prime Minister by the Tory party on the 23rd of July. We're going to run through a brief bit of his history, then move on to his policies, and then finally discuss what we think about Boris in the future. So to start off, Boris made his career working as the EU correspondent for the Daily Telegraph and was quite famous for transforming that post from a relatively boring one into a very Eurosceptic, exciting and interesting position. He later went on to become the MP for Henley in 2001 and then on to Mayor of London in 2008, which he did for 2 terms till 2016. Boris then was chosen to be Foreign Secretary from 2016 and he resigned in 2017 due to Brexit. And then finally, he was chosen to be the successor to Theresa May in 2019. So let's start off with Boris's time as an MP in 2001.
Well, yeah, he was often more progressive than many of his other Conservative MPs. For instance, he voted in favour of civil partnerships, for one, in 2004. He also voted in favour of the Gender Recognition Act in 2004. And I think he voted to repeal Section 28 as well, which shows that he was quite socially liberal, and a lot of people in his party were often questioning whether he was actually conservative.
Okay, so that's the more liberal progressive side of Boris that don't often see as much nowadays. But there are also obviously controversies of his time as mayor, weren't there?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of controversies, mainly just surrounding a couple of his affairs. I think there was one affair that was reported by that came out in 2004, and he lied to Michael Howard about this. This was when he was vice chairman of the party, and then when that came out to be true, he ended up getting fired. And then the News of the World reported another affair in 2006, so he clearly didn't learn his lesson. And I think this was something that had happened before when he was a journalist. So yeah, there were a couple of scandals in there.
Okay, again, I guess that's less characteristic of a traditionally conservative MP, isn't it, to have such a liberal attitude towards marriage. Okay, so should we move on to his time as the mayor then? So this is something that is all over the media at the moment, given it's the position he held for the longest and it's sort of what he's known for, how he came to the public eye, really. So he was mayor from 2008 to 2016. He was the first Conservative mayor and the only Conservative mayor London's ever had. Broadly speaking, it's characterised by a lot of big policies, usually quite popular policies, but a lot of money spent. So what do you think? Do we think that that's a fair characterization, or?
I think it is broadly fair. And I think as well, it's something that, I mean, like we talked about before we actually recorded the podcast today, that when you're looking for resources about Boris Johnson, they are very polarized. There's this one side that sees him in a very positive light. You know, it's whenever there's another scandal about him, it's, well, you know, it's Boris, and that's fine. And then there's also a lot of people that think he's an idiot, really. And I think this is borne out in reviews of his time as London mayor. So you mentioned the big infrastructure projects, and I think actually some of those things, although they're quite wasteful, like the Boris bikes, bringing back the red buses and getting rid of the bendy buses, these are things that are actually quite popular with the public, despite the fact that they might not be the most efficient choice. And I know we're going to talk about the present and the prospects for the future a bit later in the podcast, but I think his time as London mayor was catalytic, really, when you look now at the sorts of policies he's been talking about in the last few days. So spending on rail, big rail infrastructure projects, spending in Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland for these big ticket, ambitious infrastructure projects. I think they can actually be quite popular with the public. And as much as he's been criticised, you know, Gordon Bridge and all that sort of stuff, I think actually things like the Boris bikes, his influence and his image during the Olympics, and all the other big infrastructure projects that he supported when he was London mayor are actually quite popular. And people missed that in the critique, I think.
Yeah, a YouGov poll commissioned at the end of his term revealed that 52% of Londoners revealed he did a good job as mayor of London, while only 29% believed he did a bad job. So that shows whatever you say about the policies, he was quite a popular London mayor. I think he was very wasteful at times. The Garden Bridge wasted, £53 million, I think. And there was other vanity projects like the Boris Island. However, he did have some successes, for instance, social housing. increased drastically, I think, at a faster rate than Ken Livingstone, although the figures aren't directly comparable. The London living wage was a very, very popular step to take as well. So yeah, I think in some respects he did a very, very good job. Police numbers went up, whereas in the rest of the country they fell by about 17,000 per district. In some ways he was very wasteful, but in other ways he did a fairly decent job.
Yeah, I think as well, the way that the London mayor's office is structured and the responsibilities and the powers that the London mayor has suited Boris quite well in building that kind of big public profile in a position of power. So, for example, I remember, in fact, the single biggest thing that I remember when Boris was London mayor was there's a clip of him in the chamber where he was pulled in to face scrutiny from the chamber, the assembly in London. And he called the whole chamber a load of great supine protoplasmic invertebrate jellies. And that went viral, that clip. As a London mayor, you can boost your profile. You have control over a certain amount of money and you don't really face that much scrutiny. So I think it was also helpful for him the way that the London mayor's office is set up, that he could build a profile and didn't really have to face a massive amount of scrutiny.
Yeah, I think that for me, if we're looking at the London mayor in order to then extrapolate from that what sort of prime minister he could be, I think that one thing that it is very popular policies and in some ways very good policies. Like you mentioned the bikes earlier, they allegedly cost 60 odd million, but I do think that's been a very positive thing for London. But one thing is that he does seem to overpromise about what they'll be, and then the policies never seem to be implemented, as Ellis said, in the most efficient way. So, for example, he said that the bikes would pay for themselves through corporate sponsorships. He said that the Boris buses would pay for themselves. He said the cable car would pay for itself. And all of these end up being underwritten by the taxpayer. Now, while they are good policies, it is that tendency to overpromise that does concern me about his time as a prime minister, because I guess you're just dealing with a huge magnitude, larger amount of money rather than the 24 million or 3 million a year the bikes cost in maintenance.
Well, yeah, I think this is shown like clearly in the Olympic Stadium. An independent review said the conversion had cost 323 million, far more than the original estimate of 190 million. So that sort of solidifies what you're saying.
I think this just shows that he's desperate to be seen on the right side or on the popular side of the issue. And this is something that goes back to his days campaigning to be chairman of the Oxford Union. It goes back to his days as a journalist, the way he wrote. He just wanted to be popular and he wanted to be liked. He's always been like that. So he'll overpromise. He'll do these big vanity projects to kind of build himself up. And perhaps ultimately they'll overspend or they won't be as successful. But he never really admits that. And his supporters don't really address those issues.
I think as well, Tommy talked about him overpromising and his tendency to do that. As the mayor, and we've seen in the first few days of his time as prime minister. But I mean, really, you can make the argument that we are in the time of the overpromiser. I mean, just look over the Atlantic. We see Trump, and it's not. Well, I mean, his slogan: "We're going to make America great again. We're going to keep America great," is apparently going to be the slogan for 2020. We've got across Europe as well the kind of Salvini in Italy and other leaders across Europe as well, promising these massive things. And I suppose it's baked into the kind of populist formula, really, to promise things, these massive things. And in some cases, it can be divorced from the truth and it can be, it's not being realistic with people. But then at times as well, it also does build a sense of optimism and a sense of, I suppose, national pride. And I think you could make an argument that, well, at the very least, he's not the only one. And we will see. I suppose it remains to be seen as to whether it's going to be all that nefarious thing, because it might well build a bit of optimism and a bit of kind of national pride again after a pretty chaotic few years. But we'll see.
Overall, his record of mayor in London is mixed. For every Olympics, you have TfL fares rising.
Yeah.
If I was Boris, I wouldn't really rely on that as a effectively good stint as mayor. But I also disagree with this statement that I've heard from Labour recently to say he was a really bad mayor.
You also have a bit of a myth about his time as London mayor as well, where people said, oh, well, he won in a Labour-dominated area. Well, if you look at the breakdown of where he actually won, he won in outer London, less diverse ethnically as well, that area of London. So it is a bit of a myth that, while he's a good campaigner, he can win in Labour areas. He did predominantly rely on And we've seen this again to make the comparison. I don't think it's an easy comparison, but it's something that you can make, I suppose, with Trump and figures like that. They tend to be able to get out a solid percentage of white and predominantly male voters, actually, to get out and vote for them, to push them over the edge. And they tend to be able to win elections based on that constituency. And I think it is a bit of a misconception that Boris won London and won Labour voters, BME voters, because he did have an outer ring of support if you look at the breakdown of it as well.
I'd also say I think he, again, as Boris does, he changes to his audience, and he was quite social liberal. For instance, he openly backed Barack Obama for the 2008 election.
Yeah.
And he also called for an amnesty on illegal immigrants, I think, as well. So I guess we'll see what happens in the upcoming election, which could happen, maybe.
Okay. Now let's move on to another thing that catapulted Boris to fame, something he's very famous for, the 2016 referendum campaign. Ben, do you want to talk us through Boris's impact on that? Yeah.
We all know the history of this, and we don't want to spend too much time on it, but it is, of course, it's important that we kind of touch on this, and I think provide an opinion on it as well. So obviously Boris and Michael Gove came out for Vote Leave in 2016, and that was seen as pretty influential. Dominic Cummings has said since that won them. I think it was around 600 or 650,000 crucial kind of middle class voters. It gave people dinner party cover, as Tim Shipman wrote in his book All Out War in 2016. It gave people the cover to say, no, I'm not voting for Nigel Farage because look, these big key Conservative figures are supporting it. And there's the famous letter as well in which Boris wrote one on each side of the argument and then made his decision based on that. And I think that letter is emblematic really of a question that people are trying to find the answer to about Boris, which is we have this liberal record, socially liberal record, and he's from quite a metropolitan bohemian family. He was born on the Upper East Side in New York, and he's got family from all over the world. He's quite metropolitan liberal elite, you could almost call him. So there's that side, but then in 2016 we see this other side that's a little bit more tub thumping, a little bit more playing to certain anti-immigrant tropes, that sort of thing. But I think the way of looking at it is that Boris's views are different to the kind of Farage wing of Brexit and hinged on kind of intellectual arguments of sovereignty and the role of the European Court of Human Rights. He's on the kind of Daniel Hannan, Oxbridge Debating Society wing of Brexit, where it's more of an intellectual exercise than anything else. At least that's the way I view it anyway. And I think that will be influential in the way that he goes about negotiations moving forward as Prime Minister. I don't think he's as extreme and as pro-no deal as people think. And we'll see which side he kind of falls down on as Prime Minister, whether he keeps this kind of socially liberal side to him, the kind of the more metropolitan side, or he goes down the kind of the more Faragean route. And yeah, so I think the 2016 EU referendum campaign really it provides a good example of the contradictions in Boris's character.
So now let's move on to Boris's first cabinet role as Foreign Office Minister. So there's two really landmark issues here. One was the Zaghari Ratcliffe incident, and the other really being the uniting Europe over Russia. So Tom, do you want to talk us through the Ratcliffe issue?
So Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, a British-Iranian dual citizen, in 2016. She was over in Iran. According to her, she was visiting her daughter. She was taking her daughter to meet her grandparents and there for general kind of vacation. And she got arrested for suspicions of her being a British spy. And this was quite a big case at the time. Obviously, as Foreign Secretary, it's a big part of Boris Johnson's role to kind of help and support her. And in November, he told the Foreign Affairs Select Committee that she was there to train people in teaching and as journalists, which completely flew in the face of everything that Zaghari Ratcliffe had said in her own defense. And then the Iranian officials used this as proof that she wasn't there on holiday, that she was there as a spy, and that's why no one could get their story straight about why she was there. So this ended up in her not being released and kind of staying on there in prison. So that was a very big thing at the time. He ended up having to apologise to the House, apologising to her family. But obviously, that was one of the major gaffes from his time as Foreign Secretary.
Yeah, I think this sums up his overall sort of perception in the Foreign Office, that he wasn't a man for details. I think one Foreign Office member of staff called him Tim Nice but dim. So that says all you need to know about the Foreign Office thought of him. But he did have some success. The main one being the tough line on Russia, with the expulsion of its diplomats after the poisoning of former spy Sergei Skripal, or I probably butchered that name again, like I do every podcast, and his daughter as well. And he got 29 countries, including the US, Canada, Australia, and the EU states, to join the UK in expelling more than 140 diplomats in a coordinated move. So I think that is one success of his that he had, probably the only success. His time as Foreign Office minister was not really well received by anyone, really.
Okay, brilliant. I think that fairly comprehensively sums up Boris's history to date. But he is well known for his gaffes. My favourite one was, just because I think it sums up the Brexit position of a lot of the Leavers, was the Prosecco row he had with the Italian economic development minister, whereas he said they wouldn't want to lose their Prosecco exports to the UK, and that the Italian said that he'd lose some fish and chip exports. But the difference is that he's exporting fish and chips to 27 countries, whereas they're already exporting Prosecco to 27 countries, and they can keep doing that, whereas he can't.
Yeah, but what you forget is my mum lives in this country and not anywhere else in the EU, and she probably single-handedly keeps the Italian Prosecco market afloat.
I do think that Boris did cite your mum, so that could be part of it.
Yeah, boy.
So let's analyse some of Boris's policy pledges that he's made thus far. There's not been very much detail at the moment, but obviously this is going to develop over the coming months. But at the moment, we've got an Australian-style immigration system, which would also see the pledge to cut immigration to the tens of thousands ended. A social care funding boost pledge, which should be roughly 3.5 billion, which would be a voluntary scheme taken from wages. A schools funding pledge to meet 5k per pupil, which is roughly £50 million increase in the budget, or a 0.1% increase in the total budget for schools funding. A high-speed rail link between Manchester and Leeds, and a rollout of broadband across the UK to make sure the coverage is more comprehensive. And then finally, there's a slightly more controversial tax cut pledges and taxation pledges, and then obviously his Brexit policy. So what is it that you guys would like to discuss here?
Yeah, I think it sounds really good. I think we're all unanimous in saying that we need some investment in this country to try and sort of, I guess, pre-recession investment to try and help us get through the potentially tough times ahead. The only issue is how he's going to pay for it all, and he hasn't quite outlined that. For instance, apparently his broadband plan, figures of 30 billion have been cited for that. So he's got to try and find 30 billion from somewhere. His no deal planning, 2.1 billion.
Tax cut costs roughly 20 billion. And that's just what he's outlined. He's hinted at perhaps more.
Exactly. And apparently the Chancellor has less than fiscal headroom, but this only amounts to 26.6 billion. So where is the rest of the money going to come from?
So that can't even cover one of his schemes.
Yeah, perhaps borrowing. It's a good time to borrow. Interest rates are notoriously low. However, I do find it quite funny that we've been told repeatedly, we have to balance the books, and now we've got the open checkbook out.
There is no magic money tree.
He's got this open checkbook because it kind of it marks it puts a bit of space between him and Cameron and May, doesn't it really? I think on the spending pledges, I agree. I mean, I like all of the policies in terms of spending and the immigration policy and that sort of stuff. That all sounds good. I think the one thing that didn't land very well at all, though, was the 40% tax increase in the threshold up to 80,000. I think that smacked of trying to appeal to the more affluent Tory members during the Tory election campaign. What I did like from the Tory election campaign, was actually what Dominic Raab was saying about taxation. The idea of increasing the minimum income tax threshold, continuing that policy, and exemptions from, I think it was national insurance as well for lower earners. I quite like that Boris has stolen Dominic Raab's policy on that, and I hope that comes in rather than the tax cut.
I do think it's a difficult one because there is definitely some truth to some of the arguments that have been made for lifting the 40p rate. There's definitely a lot of people who say are earning just over that threshold. Let's say you're living somewhere in the southeast and you're earning £55,000 a year, and you're the single earner for a household. That's not a lot of money. You know, you're not particularly middle class. You're not living very well off. There's definitely something to be said for the kind of slow squeeze on the middle class that we've been seeing. But at the same time, with the amount of polarization between the rich and the poor, can you really justify a tax cut for people who are, you know, slightly better off? Especially when he's talked about cutting the tax-free allowance and other things like that, which again would affect the people who are really worse off.
Yeah,
well, this is a choice the party's got, isn't it, between the home counties, the shires, the southeast, and those people who are kind of in between that the threshold and this policy would be good for them. And you've got the people in the Stoke-on-Trent, the Mansfield, the Walsalls that the Tories picked up in 2017 and need to capitalise on. I suppose he's faced with a choice between shoring up that traditional Tory support that is a little bit more affluent and going for those Brexiteer, more working class votes.
Yeah, I think he's trying to do both, really.
Yeah.
Because obviously there is there's the national insurance pledge, as you were saying, and he's also trying to invest in the NHS. Apparently he plans to spend hundreds of millions of pounds on hospitals and healthcare technology. So he seems to be appeasing the poorer voters, let's say, by promising infrastructure and tax cuts to them. But then he's also shoring up the base with this potential tax cut. Apparently this will benefit pensioners the most. They'll stand to gain, I think, over £6,000 from this tax pledge. So I think he's just trying to appease everyone, like, I guess, the One Nation Conservative he is.
But I guess also that we can look at again, as we said earlier, the record as mayor, to say, again, huge popular policies, and then again, huge amount of funding required for all of them. A lot was spent on those. Not all of them followed through. So I can see, particularly with the broadband one and the high-speed rail, perhaps, those do smack of the Garden Bridge, Boris buses type policies, which are very expensive and not particularly well thought through. Like Ellis just said, the £30 billion pledge for the broadband. I mean, where's that money coming from? And then also that's his pitch. So obviously that's going to balloon to however much more. So I think that is one thing. I do hope that there's more constraint on him as a prime minister, which I do think there is, because he's got to pass these things through the House, and I think there's going to be more constraint on how he's able to just freely spend that sort of money. And I think that hopefully that should mean that only the more fiscally responsible policies do pass through.
But well, as we were saying, we do need more investment in the country, and additional spending is personally welcomed by me. It's just as you said, to the extent of it. And this is before we've even talked about the corporation tax cuts.
Oh, geez.
Apparently, which will cost 3.1 billion. Yeah. But what I will say is, say we do leave the EU without a deal, perhaps decreasing corporation tax will encourage business to stay and perhaps still go to the UK because it's so much more competitive than the rest of Europe.
Yeah.
All right. So I think we've covered a lot of his policies, but what we really want to talk about is the future. What do we think's the road ahead for Boris and the country? So as we see it, there's 5 options. The first one is no deal, which is the one that's being talked about most. Second would be a renegotiated New Deal, which Boris is saying that he's going to go for, presumably without the backstop. The third one would be ratifying May's deal, so the withdrawal agreement as it stands. The fourth would be an election, so a snap general election, realistically this autumn. And then the fifth one would be a second referendum at some point. So what do we think, guys, is the most likely of these outcomes? And what do we think is going to be the future of Johnson's government?
I think it's a bit of a difficult question, isn't it? Because there's massive caveats to any of those outcomes. I think there's one or two that you can probably rule out, like in negotiating a new deal. I don't think we're going to get the backstop removed. Just all the rhetoric we've seen from the EU about protecting Ireland the whole time, I don't see that getting through. I don't think we're going to see him passing May's deal late on, because I think the parliamentary arithmetic hasn't changed much, and if that was going to pass on deadline day, we've had 2 of them already. I think we'll probably end up seeing a general election, and I think Labour will potentially run on a second referendum pledge. But who would win that and how that would come about, I'm not sure.
I think, though, I would contradict one thing you said, is that the parliamentary arithmetic has changed. May tried to get her deal through with a majority of 10. Boris has a majority of 1. So it's only gotten significantly worse.
Boris is known as a gambler.
Yeah.
And I genuinely think he's going to try for his Brexit plan, but in the back of his mind, I wouldn't be surprised if he fancies a general election. He's well ahead in the polls currently, and I genuinely think Boris will probably need a general election to try and get his Brexit plan through. History hasn't been kind to prime ministers with small majorities. I think the best example is Harold Wilson with a majority of 5, but then he had to have an election to increase his majority and actually manage to run a government. So
Theresa May's a good example.
Wow, yeah, she's a very recent example. If you want to go there, so I think a general election will probably be the most likely outcome. My hope is Boris tries to keep May's deal, because I'm a fan of May's deal. I think it's okay. It honours the referendum result, but still, for instance, it's a soft period. It's a soft landing, basically. I think the main thing he has to do with it is try and get a time limit on the backstop, and I think this is doable as well. Because one, this appeases the ERG and that, because we're not under the EU's discretion. 2, Ireland want us to have a deal as much as any country. I think they'll be affected by no deal after us the most out of any EU country. And yeah, 3, it still keeps the backstop, so Leo Varadkar could go back and still be the popular man he currently is in Ireland.
I think the only issue is that his aspiration to get rid of the backstop or time limit the backstop. The EU's been very firm, and it'd be interesting to see if they do row back on it. But they have been very consistent and very firm for over 2 years. That the deal they're negotiating is the final deal. Now they've negotiated that deal, and they've been very clear that the backstop is non-negotiable. And they've also said that a time limit negates the whole point of a backstop, because it's not an insurance policy if the insurance policy just ends.
You've also got the issue of the EU Parliament, kind of after the new elections, the whole changing of that, and how long they actually sit. Same with how long Parliament actually sits to get a deal ratified, if anything did go through. Just in terms of getting everything ratified and voted for would be incredibly difficult in time span.
The only
I
issue
think it'll be difficult. However, I also think we're closer to no deal than we ever have been.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think the EU genuinely would take a long-term time limit on the backstop, say 5 years or so, just simply because Varadkar will have to, because he wants to avoid no deal as much as anyone.
I think it'd be interesting to see if they did, and I think that's the only route that would lead to anything but a no deal, but other than an election. But one thing I do have an issue with is the fact that he said his 31st of October pledge is so firm, is that even if he's basically got a deal, he's made it so clear that he won't then extend that he could have the deal made and he wouldn't be able to pass the legislation to ratify it before 31st
He's
October.
created red lines, which is what Theresa May did.
And
that
I
was
want
what Jeremy
I want
Hunt
him
was saying, wasn't
exactly,
it?
that's exactly what Jeremy Hunt was saying. I want Johnson to say, okay, we've got our deal. I'm extending it by a month to pass this legislation, but we're still Brexiting. But I don't know if he has the political capital to be able to do that.
It's also Boris Johnson, though, as in how many times has he gone back on his word in the past? He changes like the wind, so
He really does.
you can never really take what he...
I think
the difference is, I think he changes like the wind, but he's changed on slightly smaller side issues. I think Brexit is the fuel that's got him to number 10. Really, it's his number one pledge. It's the reason that he is the kind of savior of the Tories, or the future for the Tories, is because his support for Brexit and his unwavering kind of support for it is what's brought working class voters and people like, say, Stoke South, as Ben talked about. They brought them into the fray, and I think there's a massive amount he could potentially lose by rowing back on it.
So I think the other big one is a an election. So I think the current timetable I've seen would be that they'd have to table the motion of no confidence in the government the day after Parliament resumes, win it, and then that would be the shortest period possible to have the election in time before your 31st of October deadline. How do we think that would go?
I don't see Tory rebels voting him out on the first day of a new sitting Parliament. Well, I don't see that happening. I think if he had a bit more time and it got close to no deal, maybe you'd start to see a few rebels kind of go for him. But straight away, I don't see it happening.
Yeah. The thing is, you don't even need the Tory rebels these days. That's why you just need the DUP. Some of them to turn around and be like, we're not accepting.
Yeah, are the DUP going to vote him out when they could potentially end up with a Corbyn government? And I don't see that happening.
I don't know. I think it depends on whether or not all the disgruntled Tories who desperately don't want no deal. If Boris is very much agitated for no deal at that point, I think there's enough Remainers in the Tory party to possibly. But it's whether or not there's more of them than there are the Leave Labour people.
And also, as we were saying, I think Boris always wants an election so he can try and increase his majority. He needs it. You can't get anything through with a majority of one when you're in a supply and what is it called?
Supply arrangement. Yeah,
exactly. Like it's almost impossible to get anything through. And looking at the polls, I think he'd back himself to do well in that.
Yeah.
Well, he's already on election footing with all his popular promising, his big spending pledges, all of these things. That looks like he's fronting up for an election already.
I think if I was Boris, I'd be very scared, having seen the recent by-election in Brecon and
Brecon, yeah.
I don't think you can read too much into that.
Well, no, you say that, but one thing that you can see about that is the fact that the thing that stopped the Tories winning is the Brexit party. So if I'm Boris, I'm looking at that and going, they are still a threat.
But the Tories didn't contest it. They didn't want to win it. So they had a by-election because the guy had an expenses scandal, and they had the same guy running, and they kept the same candidate and didn't really campaign at all.
But I think that it's important to note, though, that the traditional Tory voters there did go Brexit party. 3,000 of them went Brexit party. And I think if I'm Boris, that's what I'm most concerned about in an upcoming election.
I think a big election campaign with Boris Johnson giving it full guns and a spate of new candidates and people actually campaigning, he can steal back a lot of those Brexit
Although
votes.
one big threat is also the Lib Dems in the South. In the South, the Lib Dems are more popular than the Tories in a lot of constituencies where the Tories traditionally would be winning, but they're just Remainer anti-Brexiteers, so they would.
Then you look at his northern policy; he's always making a raid on Labour in the north as well. Like, who cares if they lose one constituency down south if they win two up north?
But then again, who cares? If you try and fighting and you win one up north and then you lose your three down south, who are your heartland, again, it can go either way. I mean, they're more popular in Wales than ever before, which is interesting. So that could be
very difficult to call.
But then they're much less popular in Scotland. So it's all so up in the air.
Then again, even in Scotland, the Brexit party came second in the EU Parliament elections. So to just disregard Scotland would be stupid, as in there was still a sizable amount, there's still a sizable minority of people who voted for Brexit that aren't being taken into consideration by the SNP.
But there are also people who don't like Boris. Like, Boris is disliked by the Scottish, so they're probably more like the Brexit party.
That's why Ruth Davidson will be crucial.
Yeah, it depends. And she's already made it. She's already given him a bollocking about it as well. So
yeah, he's got to patch things up with her because she is crucial in him getting a bigger majority.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I think we've fairly comprehensively covered everything there. Obviously, not in as much detail as we'd like, but if we were going to do a podcast on Boris with full detail, it'd be 3 days long. So thanks everyone for joining. All right, see you all next time.